Welcome back to Indians, Jacks, and Pines by Stuart D. Gross and published in 1962. Chapter 14, 10 Hours or No Sawdust, Strike on the River. The sawmills along with Saginaw wind and spit sawdust 11 hours a day until, that is, 1885, when the mill workers went on strike for a 10-hour day. It was one of the first labor disputes in the Saginaw Valley, and certainly the first that reached such bitterness and violence. It started with the cry of the sawyers, 10 hours or no sawdust, and it swept upriver from Bay City to reach a climax of anger in Saginaw. Answering the sawyers were the mill owners with work 11 hours a day or no flour on the table. The National Guard was called out, mill owners insisting the local governments would be held responsible for damage to their mill properties, and forced the city fathers to call in the Pinkerton Detective Agency. It ended with the capitulation of the mill owners, not to the strikers, but to the law of the state. The strike's one importance in history was the fact that it acted as a spur to the legislature to pass one of the first laws for social reform. The mill working day was from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., 1 hour off for lunch. Pay was not great, even in those days. Butter at 16 cents a pound and eggs at 10 cents a dozen. On July 6, 1885, the employees of several Bay City mills refused to go to work. They demanded a 10-hour day with pay equal to that earned in 11 hours. The demand was rejected. Word came to East Saginaw the strikers would come up the river to get the workers there to join in the strike. The Saginaw Knights of Labor, headed by Thomas B. Berry, was indifferent to the Bay City trouble. However, the next day, when dockhands unloading a barge in Saginaw demanded 40 cents an hour, a 10-cent raise, they walked off the job when the demand was refused. Berry then took an interest in the strike. 4 days later, 900 Bay City strikers came to Saginaw on the barge transport. A group of Saginaw sawyers met them, and they marched to Washington and Genesee Avenues. The Bay City group had thoughtfully brought along a band, and the men quick-stepped to the Knights of Labor headquarters to the tune of Rally Around the Flag Boys. Later they marched to the various mills and closed them down. The following Monday, a force of Pinkerton detectives arrived from Chicago and were sworn in as special deputies. Tenseness gripped residents on both sides of the river. Locals, fearing the worst, asked Governor Russell A. Alger for the services of Company E of the National Guard. Governor Alger approved and later also ordered the Flint Blues Company H of Lansing and the Alpena Company to Saginaw. The presence of the militiamen helped calm the fears that violence would indeed erupt. Berry was arrested on a charge of conspiracy. He was arraigned and pleaded innocent and released on $3,000 bail. By this time, the Saginaw strike was known throughout the entire state. Governor Alger himself and his staff arrived. Law and order must be enforced, the governor declared. A sufficient force is now on hand to ensure the preservation of order. Acts of violence or intimidation will be promptly punished. Some mill owners began to reach settlements on the 10-hour day demand, and both sides, however, concluded that time alone would produce a final settlement. The situation appeared so calm that the Pinkertons were dismissed. Then the Rust, Eaton and Company mill, at the foot of what is now Rust Avenue, tried to resume operations. The mill got a full crew together, willing to work for 11 hours a day. A day or so later, a crowd of 200 men gathered in front of the mill to preserve order. Mayors of both cities ordered police to see that no damage was done to the mill or that anyone was injured. The last violence of the strike occurred at Weber and Washington Avenues, where a detail of police stopped a marching line of strikers and dispersed them. After this, the strikers were willing to talk peace. Wellington R. Burt was named as mediator between the strikers and the mill owners. Nothing concrete emerged. The men went back to work, and some in the 10-hour-a-day mills and other in the 11-hour-a-day mills. While all this was going on, the legislature had been considering a bill that would set a day's work at 10 hours. It was passed a short time after peace came to the Saginaw mills, and meanwhile the charges of conspiracy against Berry had been dropped quietly. Saginaw went back to its job of cutting pine. Chapter 15, Salty Saginaw. Beneath the state of Michigan, there is enough salt to turn the fresh water of the Great Lakes into brine. Salt no longer is a big business here, but when lumber was king, Saginaw was among the nation's leading salt producers. Salt springs, or derelicts, were well known to the Indians. These were places where briny water seeped to the surface and provided the wild animals with the salt that they craved. Best known of these salt springs were along the Tittabawassee and Salt Rivers. Dr. Douglas Houghton, state geologist in 1837, spoke about the commercial possibilities of the Salt River Springs. An attempt was made on order of the legislature to drill 2 test wells to determine if salt could be produced commercially from wells near the Grand River, about 3 miles below below the then village of Grand Rapids and near the mouth of the Salt River in Midland County. By 1842, the state had spent $15,000 on the 2 wells, but the attempts were not conclusive. The salt lands of the state were then platted into lots and leased with the rights to manufacture salt. However, the law provided a state tax of 4 cents per bushel of salt, 56 pounds produced. This tax was repealed within a few years. In 1859, a group of Grand Rapids businessmen asked the legislature for $10,000 to finance further tests for salt at the Grand Rapids well. The request was denied. In the same year, East Saginaw businessmen who had faith in salt as a business asked the state to establish a bounty for salt production. A bill was prepared proposing that the state pay 10 cents bounty on each barrel of salt. This sent the legislators into gales of laughter, and one who thought to make the joke even bigger moved to make the bounty 10 cents a bushel, equal to 50 cents a barrel. Carried away by their humor, the legislature passed it, and it became law. The East Saginaw businessmen didn't waste their time laughing. Jesse Hoyt provided 10 acres of land near present 6th and North Washington Avenues in Saginaw for the first well. It was drilled to a depth of 633 feet, where good brine was found. The company built a plant for the manufacture of salt. These plants became known as salt blocks. Wood was used to boil the brine in kettles, and after the water was evaporated, salt crystals were left. The production of the first year was 10,722 barrels of salt. The second year, it jumped to 32,000 barrels. The legislature by this time had stopped laughing. Without so much as a grin, it repealed the bounty law in 1861. As a result, East Saginaw Salt Manufacturing Company received only $3,174 in bounty money from the state and had to go all the way to the state Supreme Court to get that. The company's success spurred others. In 5 years, the production of salt here reached 529,000 barrels. Wells were drilled in Saginaw, Carleton, Bay City, Huron, and Oscoda counties. A Midland well was drilled to 1,300 feet to bring up a rich brine that was to make Midland famous as the location of the Dow Chemical Company in years to come. Early efforts to produce salt were not too profitable. The cost of wood needed for the fires to boil the brine was high, and the product brought only a small price on the market. It wasn't until the salt makers and the sawmill owners got together to use the byproduct of the mills, slab wood, sawdust, and steam, that salt making became profitable. Not a dollar in profit was made in salt prior to 1870, but for the next 20 years, things were different. By 1880, production had reached almost 2,678,386 barrels, or more than 13 million bushels of salt. The first salt makers were inexperienced and based on their manufacturing process on New York and West Virginia operations. But the Saginaw brine was different from the brine pumped elsewhere. The Saginaw brine contained iron, which made the salt rusty, bromides of sodium, which made it bitter, and gypsum, which made it cake. To eliminate these impurities, the brine was pumped into big settling tanks built on pilings of lumber. As soon as the tank was filled, fresh slaked lime was sprinkled over the brine. It was mixed, then allowed to stand for 48 hours until it became crystal clear. The iron, which had a chemical affinity with the lime, was precipitated to the bottom, and the clear brine was drained away. The first salt was made in kettles. These buildings consisted of 2 rows of 25 to 30 cast iron kettles, each holding 100 to 120 gallons of brine. The building was constructed in such a way as to let the steam escape through the roof. When the brine was boiled about 1/3 away, the salt was dipped out with ladles into draining baskets, then dumped into salt bins. This was a 24 hours a day operation. Each building produced about 27 barrels of salt daily. Later, the pan block was used, and the pan blocks were made of 1/4-inch boiler iron. They were from 90 to 120 feet long, 12 to 10 inches deep, and 12 to 15 inches wide, or feet wide. As the brine stood in the pans, small bits of rancid butter were dropped on top. This formed an oily film, and the salt formed beneath it in even crystals. Without the film, the crystallization would not have been uniform. Another method known as solar manufacture, in which the sun did the work. These solar blocks covered more ground, and shallow wooden vats 16 by 18 feet in size and 6 to 8 inches deep were built on foundations 2 to 3 feet above the ground. Each vat had a cover which could be used to protect the brine in case of rain. No lime was used in this process because of the different conditions. The iron content was precipitated by the long exposure to the air. The time required to produce salt in this manner depended on the weather, usually from 6 weeks to 2 months. There were 3 crops a season, the first about the middle of July, the second in early September, and the last in October. The second crop was generally considered the best as the crystals were the largest and much in demand by meat packers, but the solar method was too slow and by 1888 had almost disappeared from use. In 1888, there were 6 salt districts in Michigan. Saginaw County led with 1,050,265 barrels of salt. Bay County produced 805,834 barrels, and others making lesser amounts were Huron County, St. Clair County, Iosco County, Midland County, Manistee County, and Mason County. The total amount of salt produced in Michigan from the start of the industry to January 1st, 1889 was 45,180,123 barrels. And when the lumber era ended, the salt age all but died too. There were attempts to keep salt making alive in the Saginaw Valley by using heat from locally mined coal, but this method could not match the cheap fuel from the sawmills. The Saginaw salt industry died because salt became too expensive to make. But brine wells continue to pump today throughout the valley, not to make salt, but to produce chemicals at the great Dow Chemical Company in Midland. The Dow firm has a network of brine wells throughout this entire area, and pipes run from the wells to the Dow plant. Chapter 16. The Red Sash Brigade. A spirit of adventure was in Saginaw, the lumbering capital. It was in the whine of the saw slicing through the giant pine, the grace of men balancing delicately on logs in the big booms, working with pick and peavey, and the busy toot-toot of the steamboats as they moved down the Saginaw River with their barge tows laden with pine for the world. Water Street, then Tilden, was paved with sawdust. The sidewalks were of clear white pine plank. Cedar blocks formed the pavement over which the lumber barons drove their beautifully matched teams of horses, drawing carriages with the fancy fringe on top. In the spring, the pine forest sent not only the logs to Saginaw, but the lumberjacks too. Big burly men who worked hard, played hard, and fought for the love of it. They came to Saginaw by train to the Pere Marquette station on Potter Street, and Saginaw welcomed them. Among these lumberjacks were French Canadians who wore a red sash about their waist, and the public, always quick to put a nickname on, soon called the annual trek of lumberjacks to the city the Red Sash Brigade. It was the mark of a good man to be able to fight, and anyone could get a fight by standing on a street corner and bellowing, "I can lick any man in town." He always got his chance to prove it. It took some equally tough policemen to handle these men fresh from the woods and hunting for excitement after a dull winter in the logging camps. Patrick Kane and Timothy McCoy, who later became chiefs of the Saginaw Police Department, were 2 who helped keep the peace. When it became necessary, they would move in, whack a few heads with their nightsticks, and then trundle the unconscious lumberjacks off to jail. Saginaw turned out another product besides pine in these days. There was buried in the soft, resilient sawdust piles that bordered the river a disease known as footlight fever. For a time, Saginaw was known as the great producer of theatrical talent. There was chubby Leela Korber, who attended the Hoyt grade school. She would grow up to become a Marie Dressler and a very great actress. George Levine worked in a sawmill and boxed on Saturday nights. He was to become the famous Saginaw Kid, lightweight champion of the world from 1893 to 1899. And young Tim McCoy watched his father handle lumberjacks. He was to grow up to become the great star of the Western movies. Fred Jenks practiced falls on the sawdust piles and became so adept at making others laugh at his antics, he became producing clown for the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus. He teamed up for a while with another Saginawan, Harry Watson, and they are credited with originating the now famous clown band that no circus is complete without. Watson, however, went on to entertainment heights with another sawdust product, George Bickle. The team starred in early Ziegfeld Follies and were world famous. There were others. The Picard brothers went on to be aerialists in the circus, and the Thomas family adopted the name of the Flying Malzoras and thrilled thousands with their breathtaking trapeze stunts under the big top. The Academy of Music was one of the finest vaudeville houses in the country. Opened in Saginaw on December 16, 1884, and the famous of the entertainment world came to Saginaw to perform. The Academy was destroyed by fire in April of 1917 and was not rebuilt. It's probably just as well. The vaudeville that made it famous was doomed to die anyways. The lumber barons, the men who lumbering and mill operations brought them wealth, were in a class of their own. They had money, and they spent it lavishly. In 1859, the Hotel Bancroft had its formal opening. It was a grand affair, too, and the best people in Saginaw and Bay City were invited. A chef was imported from Paris, and the guests came glittering in jewels, fine dresses, white ties, and tails. But Kurt Emerson didn't get an invitation. Kurt was a boss logger, too, and he reportedly brooded about this seemingly obvious oversight. And as he brooded, he got an idea. When all of the guests were assembled in the great dining room, Kurt entered lightly. He sprang to the top of the dining table and then walked the entire length, kicking crystal, drinks, and centerpieces right and left. The next day, he happily paid for all the damages. Then there was little Jake, the Barnum of merchants. Little Jake Seligman stood less than 4 feet 11. He came to Saginaw in 1872, and his arrival couldn't go unnoticed. He dressed in loud checkered suits, matching ties, and yellow shoes. He sported a black mustache that was carefully waxed and tapered at both ends. His store was now where Heaven Riches now stands, and when the lumberjacks hit town, he would meet them at the station with a band and would march them from Potter Street to the store. As the lumberjacks milled around in the street, little Jake would appear at the second-story window and throw a few vests into the crowd. Any jack bringing in a vest would get a free coat and a pair of trousers to match, and the fighting over the vests was fierce. Finally, a lumberjack would stagger into the store, the tattered remains of the vest proudly held high. Little Jake kept his word. He gave a coat and a pair of trousers free, but charged the lumberjack $12 for a new vest, which surprisingly was the exact cost of the new suit of clothes. He was nobody's fool. Little Jake didn't confine his activities to his store. He bought the East Saginaw City Railway and renamed it the Union Street Railway. He painted the horse-drawn streetcars red, yellow, and blue. Each color meant a different route. He also was the only man ever to give his personal statue to the city. He bought the Flatiron Building at Lapeer, Jefferson, and Genesee Avenues for $40,000 and then erected a big clock tower, and atop of the clock tower he put his own statue. At least little Jake said it was a statue of himself, but some doubting Thomases among the residents disagreed. They pointed out that the statue was of a man wearing a hat and a flowing cape, and it looked more like a statue taken from a Civil War cemetery than anything resembling little Jake. To prove it was he, little Jake changed his style of clothes to match the clothes worn by the statue. Later he sold the building, but retained title to the clock and statue. These he deeded to the city. The statue remained until July 24, 1940, when a big wind blew it down. There was some sentiment to restore it, but not enough to raise the money for the job. The late state senator John P. Schuch A student of Saginaw history studied the fallen statue and concluded it wasn't a statue of little Jake at all. It was, Such decided, a statue from a Civil War cemetery. Eventually, the statue came to an ignominious, end in the scrap metal collection during World War II. Of all the lumberjacks whose caulked boots pitted the pine sidewalks of Saginaw, one has become a great legend. Silverjack Driscoll is remembered while others are forgotten. Just why the legends grew about Silverjack isn't clear. He certainly wasn't the Galahad of the Pine Forest. He spent a considerable part of his life in prison. But, man, how he could fight. He was a moose of a man, with hands for fists, and some say the greatest fighter the Michigan forest had ever produced. He was born in Canada about 1845, and he could handle axe and peavey with extraordinary skill. There are many stories about Silverjack. He was a leading figure in several of the lumber camp's ballads sung during the cold, bleak winter nights. But according to a report in the Saginaw Press, there appears agreement on the facts surrounding his fight with Joe Fournier in the saloon at Red Keg, Averill. Fournier was something of a legend himself, you see. He had a double row of teeth, it is said, and reportedly when he entered a new bar would sink his teeth into the wood railing and then announce, "That's Joe Fournier's, he's Mark." There wasn't any question when the two bully boys met that there would be a fight. There just had to be in order to prove which was the best. They finally met at Red Keg, and no challenge was necessary. Fournier got a grip on Silverjack's throat and hung on like a bulldog. Silverjack's eyes were bulging, actually, when Fournier made the mistake of putting one foot on the brass rail. Silverjack's hobnailed boots stamped on it, and the hold was broken. Driscoll landed one punch, and the fight was over. Silverjack's death has different versions, but the one that appears the most likely is that he died peacefully in bed in 1895 in Wisconsin. Fournier's death was more public. It occurred in 1876 on the sawdust-packed deck of the 3rd Street dock in Bay City when Blinky Robinson hit him over the head with a mallet. The only sport to come out of the logging camps was log rolling or burling. And in this sport, two men mount a log in the water and spin it with their feet, each trying to throw the other into the water. It takes quick muscles and great agility, and each camp had its own champion. Contests between the camp champions were arranged at the moment's notice. The prize usually was a keg of rum to the winner. And next time, I will present to you the concluding chapters of Indians, Jacks, and Pines, A Wonderful History of Saginaw, Michigan by Stuart D. Gross, and published in 1962.